Today's video is brought to you by Nerd Fitness. Ever have that feeling like you're constantly starting over on your fitness goals? Nerd Fitness is here to help. Stay tuned after the video for an exclusive discount for my viewers. It is an office made for counseling and serving the King of Gondor. Yet this role, initially for simple management of lands, would become far more pivotal. For when the line of kings would fail, this office would rule over Gondor for nearly 1,000 years. Today on Nerd of the Rings, we cover the Stewards of Gondor. The office of the Steward of Gondor is first established by romendacil I, the 8th king of Gondor. Sometime during his rule from 452 to 541 of the Third Age, he would select a person known for their trust and wisdom to take this role. The steward was notably never a member of the royal house, and was typically advanced in years, as he was not permitted to go to war or leave the realm. The role as it is initially constructed involves primarily supervising the king's halls, houses, and lands. While we know the office of the steward would be established around the 6th century of the Third Age, it would be some 1,100 years later that we would find the first whose name is recorded. This man was Hurin, from the lands of Emin Arnen. Named after the great hero of the First Age, Hurin's role would involve far more than the office had previously. He would serve as the chief counselor to the king in the Great Council of Gondor, a group made up of captains and lords from throughout Gondor's lands and fiefs. The steward was also to rule in the king's stead should he be away from his realm. Likewise, the steward would be placed in charge when the king was ill or during the period between the death of the king and the accession of his heir. Another notable trait of Hurin is that he is of royal descent, for he is a kinsman of King Menardil, whom he serves. However, he is not related close enough for him or his descendants to claim the throne. Like the king, however, he could trace his lineage back to Anarion, brother of Isildur and son of Elendil. As for Hurin, his time as steward would see one of Gondor's darkest moments, as he would play a pivotal role in ordering the kingdom during the Great Plague of 1635 to 1637. After his time, Menardil's heirs to the throne would choose their stewards from Hurin's descendants, rather than from other noble Gondorians. The next known steward comes some 200 years later. Serving under King Ondoher is Pelendur. In 1944 of the Third Age, when the steward is 65 years old, the king and both of his sons die in battle against the Easterlings north of the Morannon. This leaves Pelendur in charge of the kingdom until a new king could be chosen. And this comes at a pivotal juncture for both Gondor and the northern kingdom of Arnor, for there are two claims to the throne. In the north is Arvedui, the crown prince of Arthedain, who had married King Ondoher's daughter 4 years earlier. However, the Gondorians do not wish to have a descendant of Isildur upon the throne, and instead choose Eärnil, the general who had defeated both the Haradrim and Easterlings. Pelendur plays a pivotal role in rejecting Arvedui's claim, adding that the heritage of royalty was reckoned only through sons. Despite Arvedui's counter-arguments, the Council of Gondor awards the crown to Eärnil. For the next 53 years, Pelendur would serve under Eärnil until his death at the age of 119. During his time, Gondor would send a great fleet north to aid the remnants of Arnor in war against the Witch King, with the king's son Eärnur leading the forces. Upon Pelendur's death, the office of the steward is officially made an hereditary position and would continue to pass through the line of Hurin to its last days. Pelendur's son is Vorondil, who would serve as steward for 31 years after his father's death until his own. During his stewardship, Gondor would lose Minas Ithil to the Nazgul. The Ringwraiths would take the Palantir that dwelt there later delivering it to Sauron in Barad-dûr. The city they would take for their leader, creating the desolate fortress of Minas Morgul. Vorondil is known as a great hunter, and presumably in his younger days, he would hunt the kine of Eorl, a race of oxen near the Sea of Rhûn. From one of his kills, he would fashion the Great Horn, an heirloom of his house that would last for around 1,000 years, coming all the way to Boromir, son of Denethor II. Vorondil dies in 2029 of the Third Age at the age of 110, and is succeeded by his son, Mardil. Mardil becomes the third steward to serve King Eärnil II, after his father and grandfather. 14 years into his stewardship, Eärnil dies and the kingship passes to his son Eärnur. Eärnur, who had been humiliated by the Witch King during their battles in the north, is challenged by this great foe to single combat. Fortunately, Mardil is able to speak wisdom to Eärnur, convincing him not to accept. However, 7 years later, the Witch King renews his challenge, taunting the king. This time, Eärnur would not be restrained, and rides to Minas Morgul, never to be heard from again. Unfortunately, Eärnur had no wife and no heirs, and there were none with claim of pure Númenórean blood, and none with claim that all would accept. Fearing another Gondorian civil war like the Kinstrife some 500 years earlier, no king is selected, and thus begins the time of the ruling stewards of Gondor. Because no one knew of Eärnur's true fate, Mardil swears an oath to hold rod and rule in the name of the king until he shall return. This same oath would be sworn by each of his successors. Mardil goes on to rule Gondor for 30 years, a reign marked by his steady hand, leading him to be remembered as Mardil Voronwe, meaning Mardil the Steadfast. During his rule, he would also introduce the Stewards' Reckoning, a new Gondorian calendar which consisted of all months having 30 days, and 5 days outside the months, with a sixth added in years divisible by 4, but not 100 to account for a leap day. After Mardil's death in 2080, the next group of ruling stewards would enjoy a relatively hardship-free time known as the Watchful Peace, a period of 400 years when Sauron would retreat from Dol Guldur to the lands of Rhûn, ceasing his activities in the west. Thus passed the rules of his son Eredan, then Herion and Belegorn. So also the rules of the mightily named Hurin I and Turin I. Turin was unique among Gondorian nobles in that he married twice and had several children. For generations, the naming after famed First Age figures would continue. The next is Hador, who rules Gondor for 117 years, before dying at the age of 150 years old, the last Gondorian to live to such an age. During his rule, he would also add an extra day to his ancestors' calendar, thus reducing the millennial deficit and keeping the calendar in sync with the seasons. He is succeeded by his son Barahir, then Dior, who is the last of the ruling stewards to fully enjoy the Watchful Peace. As Dior had no children when he died at 107 years old, he is succeeded by his sister Rion's son, Denethor I. Like his forebears, Denethor could be named after a First Age figure, the Nandarin elf who dwelt in Osiriand and fought against Morgoth's forces. Sauron returns to Dol Guldur in 2460 of the Third Age, ending the Watchful Peace, and the lands of Gondor would come under threat once more. During Denethor's reign, Uruks from Mordor would attack and overrun the lands of Ecthelion, capturing the former Gondorian capital of Osgiliath in 2475. In response, Denethor's son Boromir would move against the invaders. Now, a quick note, while the names are the same of the later father-son pairing, these are not the Denethor and Boromir we meet in The Lord of the Rings. We'll get to them in a bit. Boromir successfully reclaims Osgiliath and the lands of Ecthelion from the orcs. However, Osgiliath is left a ruined city, and its bridge over the Anduin is broken. This leads the Gondorian populace to abandon the city. During his campaign against the orcs, Boromir would receive a Morgul wound, a similar affliction to what Frodo experienced on Weathertop. It is during Denethor I's reign that the Ramas Ekor, the Great Wall surrounding the Pelennor Fields, was built. It's worth noting here that the text only tells us that it was built with a great amount of labor after Ecthelion fell under the shadow of the enemy, and that it was during the rule of Steward Denethor. This could honestly fit with either this steward or the one that we know from The Lord of the Rings, though the fact that the wall is described as partly ruinous makes it less likely to have been built just 35 years before we see it in The Return of the King. After Denethor's death in 2477, the stewardship would pass to Boromir. Sadly, the Morgul wound he had received during his battles with Mordor would shorten his life and lead him to be shrunken with pain. However, this once mighty warrior would endure and survive the Morgul wound for 14 years. He dies having ruled just 12 years as steward, passing the role to his son, and one of the most influential stewards to ever rule, Cirion. Cirion inherits a kingdom in decline in 2489. Ecthelion is deserted from the conflicts with Mordor. The Corsairs of Umbar raid the coastal fiefs, and Calenarthon, the northern lands of Gondor, have become depopulated. Concerned about the threat of invasion, specifically from the north, Cirion places scouts along the Anduin between Mirkwood and Dagorlad. There they would discover an enemy faction of Easterlings, the Balkoth. In 2509, 20 years into his rule, Cirion learns of Balkoth mustering for an invasion of Gondor. Cirion dispatches 3 groups of 2 riders each to find their old allies in the north, the Eotheod. Knowing not whether his message would even reach the horsemen, or if the horsemen would respond, Cirion sets out to meet the Balkoth in battle. As Gondor is facing defeat on the field of Celebrant, Eorl the Young, leader of the Eotheod, rides to their aid, defeating the enemy forces. After the victory, Cirion would give Eorl's people the lands of Calenarthon, giving Gondor a valuable ally on their northern border. Given the change in Gondor's lands, Cirion determines the tradition of Isildur should no longer take place, this being the practice of the rulers of Gondor bringing their heirs to Elendil's secret tomb. Rather, he removes Elendil's tomb, now on the border of Gondor rather than its middle, and has it relocated to the Hallows of Minas Tirith. Cirion would die some 57 years later, after ruling for 78 years. He is succeeded by his son Halas, who not only witnessed the gifting of Calenarthon to the Eotheod, but is also the one who devises the terms Rohan and Rohirrim for the new land and its people. He and the following 4 stewards would rule during times of relative peace: Hurin II, Belecthor I, Orodreth, named for Galadriel's nephew of the First Age, and Ecthelion I, who would rebuild the Great Tower of the Citadel in Minas Tirith, known from that point on as the White Tower of Ecthelion. When Ecthelion I dies childless, he is succeeded by Egelmoth, the grandson of Orodreth's sister Morwen. According to the peoples of Middle-earth, Egelmoth's rule would see renewed war with the orcs. Likely it is this conflict that makes him unable to send aid to Rohan in 2710. In that year, King Daor asks for help in driving Dunlendings away from the Ring of Isengard. In their preoccupation with hostilities from the east, Gondor had not realized the line of chieftains stationed at Isengard had failed, leading the hostile Dunlendings to take over the area. Following Egelmoth is Beren, again named after the great First Age hero of men. During his reign, starting in 2743, Gondor would face repeated attacks from the corsairs of Umbar along the coast. During the long winter of 2758 to 2759, the Gondorians were under attack once again, leaving Beren unable to send aid to Rohan, which was under attack by Wulf and the Dunlendings. Beren's son, Beregond, known as the greatest captain since Boromir, defeats the invaders before the spring of 2759, and then sends aid to the Rohirrim. After the wars of both kingdoms, Beren would give the Key of Orthanc to the wizard Saruman the White, seeing value in having a strong ally on the northern border of Rohan. After Beren's death in 2763, Beregond would come into his stewardship. Under this mighty warrior's lead, Gondor would begin recovering strength for the first time in centuries. During his rule, orcs would come fleeing from the Misty Mountains, crossing Rohan and settling in the White Mountains. They would later discover that these creatures were fleeing from the War of the Dwarves and Orcs. Over the years, many skirmishes would occur between men and orcs before the latter is wiped out. After Beregond's death in 2811, his son, Belecthor II, would become the 21st ruling steward. He would come to be known for two dubious reasons. Belecthor is the last of the ruling stewards to live over the age of 100 years, as the line continued to dwindle. Upon his death in 2872, at the age of 120, the White Tree of Gondor also dies. As no sapling could be located, the tree is left standing, as the Gondorians would say, until the king returns. Belecthor II's son, Thorongil, would succeed him upon his death, though Belecthor's advanced age would mean that Thorongil was already 90 years old by this time. He would serve for only 10 years until his own death, leading his son Turin II to sit on the throne of the steward in 2882. During Turin's reign, Ecthelion would be further infested by orcs of Mordor, leading to an abandonment of the lands that would last through the War of the Ring. However, the Gondorians would not yield these lands unfought. Turin would build secret locations in Ecthelion for his soldiers, including Heneth Anun, the very location Faramir would one day take Frodo and Sam. In addition, he would fortify the Isle of Caer Andros in an effort to protect Anorion. However, his chief peril would lie in the south, where the Haradrim would take over South Gondor. King Fulquina of Rohan would fulfill the Oath of Eorl and send many men to fight alongside Turin at the crossing of the Poros. Sadly, the twin sons of Fulquina died in the battle. This would lead his third son to come to the throne, Thengel, the grandfather of Theoden. As weregild for his fallen sons, Turin would send great riches of gold. Turin II would be succeeded by his son Turgon, named for the great elven king of Gondolin. While his reign seems to be a peaceful one, in 2951, just 2 years before his death, Sauron would openly declare himself in Mordor. There he would gather his power, and the rebuilding of the Dark Tower of Barad-dûr would begin. Upon his death in 2953, Turgon's son Ecthelion II becomes the 25th ruling steward of Gondor. He is known as a man of wisdom, and with what power he could muster, he begins to strengthen his realm against the assault of Mordor. He encourages all men of worth from near or far to enter his service. Among those to answer this summons is a man who had served King Thengel of Rohan, Thorongil, none other than Aragorn in secret. Ecthelion would quickly grow to love Thorongil, and it was rumored that he appreciated him even more than his own son, Denethor II. This would bring about a rumored rivalry between the two young men. Thorongil would counsel Ecthelion to not trust Saruman, but instead to welcome Gandalf. Denethor, meanwhile, did not trust the Grey Wizard. It appears that Thorongil would win out, for during this time, Gandalf would be a welcomed guest in Minas Tirith. Another counsel of Thorongil is that the Corsairs of Umbar would be used to terrible effect should Sauron declare open war. Ecthelion grants Aragorn leave and manpower to attack the Corsairs in their home port. Thorongil leads a surprise attack in 2980, and the Gondorians would deliver a great defeat to their enemies. Ecthelion would never again see Thorongil, however. The secret heir of Isildur would say other duties called him. 4 years later, Ecthelion would die, and the rule would pass to Denethor. The 26th ruling steward is described as being more kingly than any of his predecessors for a long time. He proves to be a masterful ruler. He listens to counsel and follows his own mind. However, just 4 years after becoming steward, his wife Finduilas dies, having succumbed to the shadow emanating from Mordor. Denethor is left with a 10-year-old Boromir and 5-year-old Faramir. After the death of his beloved wife, he becomes grim and silent. In his desperation at the anticipated assaults from Mordor, Denethor turns to something no previous steward had dared to attempt, using the Palantir of Anor. The Palantir would grant him great knowledge of things that passed in his realm and far beyond his borders. However, the use of the Palantir would age him beyond his years, for he had to strive against Sauron's control. Notably, unlike the wizard Saruman, Denethor is uncorrupted by Sauron's efforts due to his strength of will, integrity, and right to use the stone as an heir of Anarion. Indeed, it is believed that Denethor was even able to extract information from Saruman through his use of the Orthanc stone, something Sauron was helpless to prevent. Over the years, Denethor would become blind to any struggles, save those of him and Sauron and his people and Sauron's forces. Through the events of the War of the Ring, Denethor would show both wisdom and madness. After learning of the death of his beloved son Boromir, he would look into the Palantir more often, leading him to grow in despair. When Pippin arrives in Minas Tirith with Gandalf, he would see Denethor sitting upon a small throne in front of that reserved for the King of Gondor. He would also see Denethor possessing the broken horn of Gondor, finally broken after having existed for longer than the stewards had ruled. Over all the centuries of the stewards, none would ever sit upon the ancient throne, and they would wear no crown and hold no scepter. Rather, they would sit upon this lesser throne and bear a white rod as the only token of their office. As Faramir would later recount, this did not sit well with his brother. And this I remember of Boromir as a boy, when we together learned the tale of our sires and the history of our city, that always it displeased him that his father was not king. How many hundreds of years needs it to make a steward a king, if the king returns not? He asked. Few years, maybe, in other places of less royalty, my father answered. In Gondor, 10,000 years would not suffice. Upon Denethor's descent into madness, and his death upon his self-made funeral pyre, the stewardship would have passed to his remaining son, Faramir. However, due to Faramir still being under the effects of the black breath of the Nazgul, Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth would fulfill the role until Faramir's recovery in the Houses of Healing. Faramir would finally succeed his father as steward by March 18, 3019. A month and a half later, on May 1st, Faramir would attempt to dissolve the office of the steward, for a king had finally returned. Faramir met Aragorn in the midst of those there assembled, and he knelt and said, "The last steward of Gondor begs leave to surrender his office." And he held out a white rod, but Aragorn took the rod and gave it back, saying, "That office is not ended, and it shall be thine and thy heirs as long as my line shall last. Do now thy office." Then Faramir stood up and spoke in a clear voice. "Men of Gondor, hear now the steward of this realm. Behold, one has come to claim the kingship again at last. Here is Aragorn, son of Arathorn, chieftain of the Dunedain of Arnor, captain of the host of the west, bearer of the star of the north, wielder of the sword reforged, victorious in battle, whose hands bring healing, the Elfstone, Elisar of the line of Valandil, Isildur's son, Elendil's son of Númenor. Shall he be king, and enter into the city, and dwell there? And all the host and all the people cried yea with one voice. And with the approval of the people of Gondor, Faramir would bring forth the crown of the king, which had lain in Rath-Dinin since Earnor had left to challenge the Witch King nearly 1,000 years earlier. While the custom had long been that the king would receive the crown from his aged father, or would retrieve it himself from his father's tomb, Faramir of the House of Anarion would bring the crown to Aragorn, heir of Isildur. While there was no longer need for a ruling steward, Aragorn would re-establish the role of steward, declaring Faramir would be the first of this new line, and that it would follow with his heirs. Faramir would serve as Aragorn's steward the remainder of his life, dwelling as Prince of Ecthelion in Emin Arnen, the very homeland of Hurin, the very first of the noble stewards from the 1600s of the Third Age. Faramir and Éowyn would have a son, Elberron, who would take over as steward of Gondor in the 82nd year of the Fourth Age. This second steward of Gondor would have either a son or nephew named Barahir, who would write the tale of Aragorn and Arwen, which we find in the appendices of The Lord of the Rings. If Barahir had indeed been the son of Elberron, it would make him the third Prince of Ecthelion, and third of the new line of stewards of Gondor. While we cannot say for certain, it's entirely possible that given Aragorn's 210-year lifespan, Faramir's son and grandson would have served as his steward. Upon Elisar's death in 120 of the Fourth Age, his son Eldarion would become the second High King of the reunited kingdom. And while we do not know for a fact, we can hope that indeed the line of Faramir, the line of the stewards, would continue to hold their important role in the reunited kingdom, counseling and serving for the betterment of Gondor and all Middle-earth. Now, you may not be tasked with protecting an entire realm, but getting in shape can sometimes feel like just as monumental of an adventure. That's where Nerd Fitness comes in. They match you with your own one-on-one coach who will take the guesswork out of getting in shape by creating a personalized workout and nutrition plan just for you. Whether working out at home or in the gym, your coach will keep you accountable. It's like having your own fitness wizard in your pocket. Over the past 8 years, Nerd Fitness has helped over 10,000 busy nerds level up their health in fun and sustainable ways. Mention Nerd of the Rings to a Nerd Fitness team member to get $50 off your first month of coaching. There's no long-term contracts, no cancellation fees, and a 30-day money-back guarantee. Visit nerdfitness.com/coaching to learn more and start your fitness journey today. As always, I want to say a huge thank you to all my Patreon and YouTube supporters who make this channel possible. Tom DeBombadil19, Lissamy the Cinda, Rabbi Rob Thomas, Charles Leisure, CCDC Red Team, Joe Tepper, The Mighty Mim, Andrew Carlisle, Swirled Traveler, Matthew Jeffrey, Viking Lord, Alvin Einbert, Jeremy Daniel Derby, Madame Director, Leo Vittori, Sky Carcass, Slide Belts, Dane Ragnarsson, Berto Berg, Graham Derricott, The Dark-Haired One, Wyland, Z and N, Evely, Micah Wu, and Debbie. If you enjoyed the artwork in this video, check out the artists in the description to purchase prints of their great work for yourself. Next time on Nerd of the Rings.